Hello, hello. It is time for chapter 22. Chapter 22, same forward as backwards. Yes, bunny ears for both of you. Hi, great to see you. Okay, we want to talk about lecture 22. What is the deal with lecture 22? Well, lecture 21, remember we're talking about how Earth, right, has got the interior structure, it's got tides and differentiation and radioactive decay that allows us to you figure out that there's energy coming out, and also the radioactive decay allows us to age date the rocks, right? This is this example that I gave earlier, and I made this a little bit adjustment. I said radiometric decay earlier. The proper way is that's like a mixture of things. Radioactive decay is the physical thing, right? Radiometric dating is using radioactive decay to figure out how old something is, a sample of something. So we went through that example previously, right? We're talking about how to get that answer and figure out how many years you might be depending on what you are doing in terms of your calculation, right? So that's sort of what's happening with that aspect. Now, try this. We have all of the light coming down from the sun, remember from earlier in the semester, about 1,400 watts worth. And then coming from the center outward is an additional amount of energy. Right now, at this moment, the amount of energy coming out from the bottom upward into the crust from the bottom side is like half that, several hundred, maybe, the better part of 1,000 watts of energy coming out per square meter coming out from the interior. That's a lot, but it's dwarfed by the amount from the outside. So what's going on is that the things on the surface are being driven, right? We were talking about earlier. Stuff from underneath, right? The planet part of the Earth, right? That stuff is like the lava, the magma, volcanoes. It drives tectonic plate motion, those kinds of things. That's all coming from the interior of the Earth, right? And that provides a lot of the things that we need in our lives. Now, the stuff on the surface, right? The lithosphere, the hydrosphere, the atmosphere, and then the biosphere, which is what we're made out of, right? That's the stuff driven from underneath, but then supplemented from stuff at the top coming in from the outside in the sun. So when you watch your videos and so forth about the Earth, and so we talk about how there are these different spheres, the lithosphere, hydrosphere, atmosphere, and biosphere. But at the surface, right, once stuff gets up past the crust and it's sort of sitting on top of the crust and doing stuff, that's where we are, by the way. That's where life exists for the most part, right? There's also life deep underground. But we wind up basically this stuff is cycling from the top. What are the key cycles that we see on the surface of a planet like the Earth? Right. And remember what our goal is. From an astronomical perspective, we're looking at our Earth as a planet and saying, if we're looking for other planets that might be like Earth, what kinds of things we'll be looking for? And if we're looking for life in the universe outside of our planet, what kind of signatures, what kind of view, what kind of interesting data would we collect to show that there is extraterrestrial life out there, right? So that's what we're talking about. So what are the cycles that happen on our Earth that distinguish us as a planet? Right. And you've learned this possibly in other classes like geology classes, for example, which you often talk about, earth science class, for example, maybe some environmental science classes. Well, one thing that you know is the rock cycle, right? The rock cycle is very much associated with the lithosphere. And what is the rock cycle like? You can see pictures of this in different parts of places where you have magma bubbling up and coming through the surface of the crust, right? Either from under the ocean or maybe in mountains like volcanoes and things like that. And they come up and they make rock, right? And then that rock eventually over time erodes and turns into bits or something. And then it falls and turns into little grains, maybe sand, maybe soil, that kind of thing. So you have this cycling of rock material, and then the rock will go back in to the crust somehow and then get sort of redone. You get these bits. This is like a life cycle of rocks, right? From the stuff that comes up to the stuff that comes down, and then you wind up mixing. And after all, right, the stuff that we grow our food in, the stuff we build our houses on, that's mostly rock, right? So that's kind of cool. So that's the rock cycle that you've heard of before. And then what's another cycle? Well, a hydrosphere, right, is the structure, the complicated structure of the liquid water that's in and around the surface of the Earth, right? So the hydrosphere. And so there is a thing which you've probably all heard of before. It's called the water cycle, right? The water cycle. And what is that? And that has to do a lot with the temperature and how the sun, right, heats things up and cools things down. Water, it is generally believed, reached the surface of the Earth in two major ways. We don't know yet. It's one of the mysteries of the contemporary theories of the solar system, how that water got there, or what percentage of the water got there in which way. But two basic ways. One is from inside the Earth. Wait a second. The Earth is a solid planet, right? Where is the water coming from? It turns out that a lot of the rock that we know has water built into it. It's actually kind of not wet, but the H2O parts actually are in the rock. Excuse me. I drink some water here. This water, right? It's H2O and is liquid because it's under the proper temperature and pressure for it to be liquid. But deep underground, the pressure is very, very high, right? And so it's being pushed down, and probably it combines chemically these hydrogen and oxygen atoms with rocks and things, or gets trapped in little bubbles, right? While the Earth is forming and it's really, really hot, and it's just high pressure swished in there. Well, what happens? You have volcanoes, right? And from the volcanoes, that stone, which comes up and bubbles, actually has all this steam kind of caught in it. And it comes out and it bubbles. Excuse me. Now I have the hiccups. Woohoo. Did you know? Nah, that's biology. This is some stuff that if someday you want to take a look at something called Your Inner Fish. Is a book, video series, is very cool. It basically shows how very possibly human evolution from fish to the present day is what causes hiccups in our mind, in us. Kind of cool, but a little beyond the scope of this course. Go check that out sometime. Your Inner Fish, really cool. Anyway, this water, right? It comes out in the form of steam. As it cools, it condenses into water droplets, and then it falls as rain, right? And it fills lakes and rivers and streams, or if it's snowpack, then it lands high on the mountains, and then as it gets warmer, then it melts and rolls down. And then you have evaporation over time, right? And then the water comes into the atmosphere, and you have water vapor, and that's the humidity that we can breathe and that plants use to grow, and it's beautiful stuff, right? So there's a water cycle that affects our lives all the time. That's what happens when you have that. And then the biosphere, okay, and the atmosphere combine, they have this cool thing, and it's not necessarily air cycle, because air is always moving, so it's kind of doesn't have its own cycle, so to speak, but there is a cycle of stuff that moves as a result of our atmosphere and as a result of our biosphere, that is life on Earth, and that is carbon. Okay, I don't know if you ever heard of this before, but it's the carbon cycle. Now, what is the carbon cycle? Well, remember, carbon, right, is the thing that knits life together. Coal is basically carbon with impurities in it, right? Natural gas, methane, is carbon in the middle attached to some hydrogens. Carbon dioxide, right? One of the greenhouse gases, one of the things that gets produced by us, the things that green plants that do photosynthesis remove from the atmosphere. That carbon dioxide is a carbon and two oxygens attached, right? So carbon is actually a very, very important atom in all the things that we do. Like, we have carbon literally every single cell in our bodies. Okay, so what happens? Well, the carbon cycle starts, right, again, with, say, rock or coal, something like that. When it burns, it goes up into the atmosphere, right? As carbon dioxide, because carbon and the oxygen combine together and up to go. So in the carbon dioxide in the air, what happens is that green plants that do photosynthesis, right, they will wind up grabbing all this great carbon dioxide that they will use as fuel. They got plenty of it. There's so much of it, in fact, that there's way too much carbon dioxide in our atmosphere right now for all the plants that exist to use it all up. So there's no supply. So as long as we have plants, the more plants we have, literally, the better off we are. Because what happens is the carbon dioxide gets turned together with water vapor into sugars and other kinds of basic ingredients that make up things like carbohydrates and fats and proteins and DNA and things like that, okay, in the plant. And then oxygen gets released as a result. Now, oxygen is a fascinating element because, well, O2, right, the oxygen molecule, is extremely reactive. And in fact, for a period of time there, oxygen was one of the most lethal poisons in Earth's atmosphere. It created massive die-off of early life here on Earth, right? And that's a discussion for a little bit later in this lecture and somewhat in the next lecture, because we're going to talk about life in more detail. But for now, suffice it to say that this carbon cycle, right, causes us to be built like plants, animals, people. We eat this stuff, right? Other elements combine to do the life processes in our bodies. And then we wind up eventually, say when a tree falls in the woods, whether or not people hear it, it does make a sound. Trust me on that. I'm a physicist. I'm an astronomer. I know that's true. Doesn't matter though. It's okay if you didn't hear it. Cognitively might not have made a sound, but different story. Again, so we wind up with a circumstance here now where you have the carbon and the carbon goes back into the soil, right? It can be drawn up in the roots, or it can actually recombine with oxygen in some sort of way. It might be some composition. It may be decomposition, actually, like the animals or the protists, the life forms that feed on the leftover organic material on Earth wind up going and turning into new stuff, which then goes up, and the carbon cycle continues, goes up and down and up and down. Okay, now what's interesting about the carbon cycle, the rock cycle, and the water cycle is that these cycles, their materials aren't always the same amount. Sometimes you can increase or decrease the amount of rock that's available, depending on how much volcanic island building or continent building there is, right? The water cycle can vary when you have all the water coming in from the surface of the Earth or underneath. Like if you could spray more water in the air, or you could spray more carbon too. Because in the same way that the water vapor as steam or water molecules are trapped in pockets of rock deep below Earth's surface in the core and in the mantle, so too can carbon dioxide or methane or other kinds of materials that get caught in sort of pockets that are being carefully held, right? In fact, that happens with a lot of different gases. Carbon and hydrogen together, when they make methane, right, natural gas, they get stored in pockets all throughout the Earth in different parts of it. And that's how you get natural gas from the Earth, right? This stuff gets piped up and then you can send it to different places all around the country or around the world in order to heat your homes and things like that, right? And that all comes sort of deep in the crust and it's been bubbling up from the mantle all this time. Same is true with waters also, right? And I didn't mention the second way that water might have reached the Earth, because I will do that in a moment. But just in case, the surface of the Earth, right, gets water from underneath and also has gotten in the past water from above. We don't know how much, we don't know exactly when, we know it was a long time ago. More on that later. Okay, bottom line, the rock cycle, the water cycle, and the carbon cycle, they keep changing the surface of the Earth. Depending on when we are looking or thinking about the Earth, it looks different. It really does. This is processes that change over millions and millions of years. Okay, so a couple 100 million years ago, around the time of those big land dinosaurs walking the Earth, right before whatever dinosaurs survived extinction events evolved into birds, what happened was during those times, there was more carbon dioxide in the air, actually a lot of carbon dioxide in the air. And what happened was it was very insulated here on Earth. And there were no, for example, polar ice caps, right? And the dinosaurs kind of roamed in this very hot, very warm kind of environment all throughout the Earth. Hundreds of millions of years before that, There's a period of time when there wasn't much carbon dioxide in the air, because some carbon dioxide, some of the carbon cycle, the availability of carbon was reduced over millions of years. And there's a periods of time when it looks like Earth was what we call a snowball Earth, right? Where you actually had the oceans were generally covered with ice, and the mountains and so forth were all very cold. So as if the North Pole and the South Pole were spread out over the entire Earth, and just only a little bit of liquid water in the surface, maybe in the equator at various times during seasons. Maybe even more thick ice than that was available. So really, it's a circumstance where you find uh, the Earth changes on time scales of millions or even hundreds of millions of years. And then the continents move, right? That heat underneath literally makes the rock up on top kind of float around the Earth and the surface. So it's really a lot of that motion going. It's kind of nuts if you think about it. The North American continent is currently drifting. It's moving. You and I are standing on stuff. It feels solid, right? But actually, no, our continent is moving toward Asia at the rate of about 3 inches a year. So that's about how fast your fingernails grow, by the way. If you think about it, like you trim like maybe a 1/4 inch off of your fingernails every month or so, multiply that by 12 months, 12 times a quarter is about 3. So actually, if you think about that, our Earth is sliding around all the time. Now, 3 inches a year isn't going to matter too much to you and me, right? We can measure it by using satellites and so forth, and we have shown that that is definitely true. Over the course of, say, a century, you're going to be moving only 100 yards or something like that, right? And it's all relative. So I can't tell if North American continent has moved 100 yards toward Asia compared with like the thousands of miles of ocean and something like that between, say, California and Japan, right? So there's this huge amount of motion, but it's very slow and very hard to tell. But if you compare it to millions of years ago, you really can tell the difference. In fact, Earth used to be pretty much, well, say about 65 million years ago, around the time that the dinosaurs were still walking the Earth, 100 million years ago, thereabouts. What we know today as North and South America and Europe and Asia and Africa were all kind of smushed together. They were all kind of one big landmass. And then there were seas that were inland on the inside, but as they drifted slowly apart and mountains changed and erosion happened, what happened is that, for example, South America, what we know today as South America, and what we know today as Africa kind of pulled apart and kind of pivoted a little bit, right? So in fact, if you today take a look at a map, and I'm going to give you a chance to do that on your own. There's lots of them. Take a look at a map of South America, and a map of Africa, and you're like, wait a sec. If I kind of slide Brazil into the Gulf of Guinea right there, that actually fits pretty well. And that's right, because it's kind of spread out slowly over time. It doesn't fit exactly because over those many millions of years, those coasts have eroded. They have changed, right? The rock cycle has been going on, the water cycle, the carbon cycle. So these things move. And we have these things that move. And you can tell that if you go from, say, New York State upward through New England into, say, New Brunswick and Quebec, there's a whole mass of rock that if you measure its rock and check out all the rock cycle stuff and so on, you see that's a lot like Scotland. That's right, Scotland, way off across on the other side of the Atlantic Ocean. It's because all that space all used to be come together, and then they pulled apart very slowly at the rate of a few inches per year. After a few million years, they're thousands of miles apart. Pretty amazing, right? So these are the kinds of things that have happened on Earth over millions of years. Now we're seeing certain changes happen over dozens of years, maybe a decade or 2 or 5 or even a century, right? In a human lifetime, we've seen a lot of changes, but those changes are very fast compared to these geological changes of what a planet looks like. Okay, does that make sense? So we're thinking about how the Earth is looking from an astronomical perspective. We think about these cycles. We think about how things have changed on the Earth over time. And we're like, oh, wow. So we're looking for things of certain density, of a certain material, and then stuff on top. But it could look very different. And Earth right? That we could recognize in many different ways, like the structure and the mass and the density and things like that, might look very different on the surface at any given time, depending on whether we were looking at a snowball Earth or a tropical Earth or a one continent Earth or a many continent Earth or something like that, right? Lots and lots and lots of stuff to think about. So I'm going to look for a planet like Earth somewhere. I want to find an Earth and see if I can find extraterrestrial life, right? Great contemporary theory of our solar system. Is there life out there? Well, let's start looking in our own solar system. Is there any place that looks like our Earth and the solar system? What are the things that we characterize the Earth with? We got a rock cycle, we got a water cycle, we got a carbon cycle, we got a core, we got a mantle, we got a crust, we have these various lithosphere, hydrosphere, atmosphere, biosphere. The only thing that we haven't found really yet is a biosphere. And the other things that we have not yet found is a hydrosphere. We have not yet found water in a liquid form on the surface of any decent sized object on Earth. Not on Earth, excuse me, in the solar system. Solar system. Wow, what a thought. Well, if we could somehow find a place with a lot of liquid water, right, in temperate temperatures, then maybe we would be able to compare it to Earth in one of those phases in the past, snowball Earth or tropical Earth or something like that. Right? Is there a place that's kind of like Earth that way? Well, you remember that earlier in the semester when you were going through all the different planets and so on, things like that, that Venus is very similar to Earth in many ways structurally, but the surface is completely different, right? Because it has had a greenhouse effect that ran away billions of years ago. And we wound up having a circumstance where the equilibrium amount of carbon dioxide in there is about 90 times all of Earth's atmosphere put together. So being on the surface of Venus is like being down in the ocean of Earth, the liquid ocean, a distance of more than 2,500 feet. Okay. In fact, you want to be exact, it's like close to 3,000 feet. Imagine if you're 3,000 feet down in the ocean, right? Remember, your eardrums pop at about 30 feet, and everything is not cool after that for you. 3,000 feet is lower than most nuclear submarines go. It's really, really tough down there. But that's what Venus is. But the surface, the temperature, even though the pressure is very high, the temperature is up around a pizza oven, right? 900 degrees Fahrenheit. It's because of all that carbon dioxide and the equilibrium temperature that it has developed on the surface of the Earth. On the surface of Venus, right? Mars, you have a different circumstance where it had an atmosphere. It probably had some atmospheric pressure and water on its surface, but it all dissipated billions of years ago because it was a little bit too far away from the sun. And therefore, it didn't have enough heat to keep things going, and it didn't have enough gravity because it has less mass than the Earth, right? Less gravity in order to hold all that gas on the surface. So the atmosphere of Mars, as you heard, remember from earlier in the semester, right, is only about 1%, heck, 1/140th roughly of the density of the atmosphere on Earth. Plus, because there is no life on the surface of Mars, right, that we have found, we've looked and looked and looked, we haven't found any. The gas that makes up the atmosphere there is also mostly carbon dioxide. We have nitrogen and oxygen in our atmosphere, which is pretty cool. But that had to do with the fact that plants created the oxygen and just sort of sat there, right? And we are breathing and we're growing and we're reproducing and things like that. So we got all that kind of stuff going on for us. So Venus could have been life-bearing, but is not. No liquid water. Mars could have been life-bearing, but again, it isn't. As far as we can tell, no liquid water. There might still be primitive life what we might call primitive, or they might be microscopic, or it's life that we haven't thought about living maybe underground on Mars, where the temperatures might be pretty stable. And if you're underground, right, remember you have the pressure of the soil or the land, right, the rock on top. So maybe there is liquid water underneath. The temperature and pressure be okay. Haven't found it yet. We found ice. We found frozen water and vast seas of it, in fact, in Mars. We found, for example, an entire icy sea, completely solid, unfortunately, no liquid water in there, but it's there and it's underground. And according to our radar mappers, the satellites that are mapping using radar, not just our eyes, but our ability to actually poke through the soil with our sensors, right? Not actually physically, but with sensors, actually being able to find a huge sort of sea, just not just one, but several. One of them, as I recall, is as big as New York, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, and Ohio put together, like this big, huge space, right? And it's all icy. So no liquid water there. But do we need to find liquid water? How important is liquid water really? Actually, if you think about it, is there any form of life on Earth that does not have water coursing through it, that does not have water as a significant component of it? Think and study, and people have tried and taken a look and basically found from the smallest bacteria to the largest whales and elephants, water is necessary. Water is necessary for life as we understand it. Okay, life that we know. Why is liquid water so important? All kinds of reasons. Remember, it's the universal solvent, right? It's a thing that allows a lot of dissolved goods to be inside it. Also, it transports things really well, right? You can take a blood cell or something and transport it along with water, basically, and blood into some other parts of your body. And then those red blood cells can release their oxygen in chemical reactions and then come back and things like that. And water is just a great vehicle to move stuff around. It helps to cause physical activity to go, and it's got the right temperature and pressure just to sort of go forth and do these kinds of things. In fact, it is most likely that life on Earth, like you and me, right, actually evolved to take advantage of the fact that there was all this liquid water around, right? It's like goes part and parcel. The water is there, so the life took advantage of it. Then life took advantage of it, and then the water was there. And so, you wind up having this very close interconnection with water. So if we're looking for ingredients for life, right, what are the things that really matter in ingredients for life? I'm going to write them down here. Ingredients for life, right? The key things. What do we need? Well, the first thing, like we said, is liquid water. Okay, so we're going to look for liquid water. And where is there liquid water in our solar system? Okay, turns out right now, we think there's liquid water underneath some surfaces. Not Mars yet. We haven't found liquid water on the surface of Mars. But we might have found liquid water further out in the solar system than Earth and Mars. Quite ironically, right? Closer in, too hot. Venus's surface temperature, thanks to its runaway greenhouse effect, its climate change that happened billions of years ago, it's all non-liquid. Mars, because it's too cold, also its climate change billions of years ago, non-liquid. But remember these tides, these tide things going on? Yeah. Turns out that Jupiter, right, that big fat planet way out beyond the orbit of Mars, it can create tides inside its moons. It is so massive that it will exercise the interior of its large moons, like Io, Europa, Ganymede, and Callisto. Okay. Now, in Io, the tides are strongest of those four big moons of Jupiter, the Galilean moons, right? Remember, you watched this in the videos, right? You wrote this down. Hope you read your study guide now too, because that's very useful too, right? That sort of stuff. At that point, if you recall, the liquid water would only exist if you could warm it up, because out at those distances, right, it's too cold. It should be ice. But if you've got the interior exercising, squishy, squishy, squishy because of the tides, in Io, it's so strong that you're producing volcanoes like crazy, right? You have this moon that's 2,000 miles across almost, like 1,800 miles. It's a pretty big moon, but its surface gets being repaved year after year. Like volcanoes are going so vigorously that just paving the surface with all of this new lava and rock. Okay, Europa, another moon of Jupiter, appears to be not made so much of rock, but has ice. It's an icy moon, and its crust looks like the polar ice caps of Earth. In fact, one of the coolest memories I have of a trip overseas I made way back in 2009 with my family, we flew over the North Pole to go from America to Asia. You know, flew from New York all the way to Shanghai and stuff like that. I've flown to Singapore as well. It's the same sort of thing. But this Shanghai trip was especially cool because we went during the summertime back in 2009. And so you fly over the North Pole in order to get there faster. It's much faster than it used to fly, like say through California and Hawaii and stuff like that to get to China. And we were visiting friends in Shanghai, and then we went to Taiwan and see my relatives. Excuse me. And then we flew back through Shanghai again. So that was really a lot of fun. We went to go see a total solar eclipse that went through that part of the world back in 2009. Great stories worth telling, but not right now. Bottom line is, when we were flying over, when we were over the North Pole area, I just thought it'd be really cool. So I went back to sort of the galley area and peeked out, you know, because everything was closed because everyone could sleep. But I went to the back and I peeked out, and it looked like ice stuff. It was the coolest thing. I mean, it's really, really neat. I mean, look with your eyes, you see pictures like, wow, that's so cool. And it reminded me immediately of pictures that I had seen of the surface of Jupiter's moon Europa. Now, those pictures as taken by spacecraft are often highlighted or enhanced with like colors and streaks and things like that. So there's sometimes like bluish, reddish streaks and so on. You can't really equate that to what we would see with our eyes if we were there. But the structure, like the seams, the cracks, the bits, things like that, it looked so much like the surface of the moon Europa, which is 500 million miles away from the sun. It's really, really neat. Basically, what's been going on there is, we think, based on all of our measurements, right? The scientists have measured and gathered data about that. And it looks, for all we can tell, like the tidal effects of Jupiter on Io causes the interior of Io to be somewhat warm. And so there's like a watery layer below the crust of Europa, right? This is the Earth, and it's got this kind of thing. But with Europa, it's very possible that its mantle layer has liquid water as part of it. It sloshes around, and we do not know how thick it is. We do not know even if it's its formal mantle, right? It might just be some sort of liquid layer between the crust and the mantle, kind of how Earth has got this sort of lithosphere, and below it, it's got that little thing that like all the continental plates slide around on, right? So it's really cool. So there may well be liquid water underneath the surface of Europa. And then, if you remember one more time, right, there is a moon of Saturn called Enceladus. Enceladus, and it not only has water on its surface, but actually has geysers of water coming out from it. The tidal effects of Saturn, 1 billion miles away from the sun, right? But it has more than 90 times the mass of the Earth. And so it is able to exercise that, right? That water on the moon Enceladus makes it go, and therefore it actually probably has puddles of water, maybe thin, small layers, maybe little caves or puddles, little collections of water. And every once in a while, they'll have a volcanic activity, which is spraying, not in our case, like lava, liquid rock, but actually water out in the form of volcanoes of water, right? It's really, really cool. Fascinating stuff. So right now, where we're looking on in our own solar system, we're looking for liquid water. We're hoping we find some liquid water underneath the surface of Mars, but we haven't found it yet. But we're pretty sure that on a global scale, like on a moon-wide scale, the moon of Jupiter, known as Europa, and possibly others, to like maybe even Ganymede, and the moon of Saturn, called Enceladus, apparently has liquid water floating around somewhere. Just don't know how much of it, don't know what's there. Tough question. Okay, liquid water was the one thing that we want to find, right? What's the second thing that we want to find? Things that we really need. Well, I already gave it away a little bit, right? Constant warmth. Remember, how does water stay liquid? Remember, we have that snowball Earth thing going on, right? And then we have like the tropical Earth thing going on. Those happen over millions and millions of years, but there's always liquid water in abundance on Earth. Why? Because there's always a constant warmth source, right? All of that differentiation we were talking about in the last lecture that caused Earth to have this metal core and this rocky metally mantle and this rocky crust on the outside, it's still releasing heat outward gently and slowly through this differentiation, through radioactive decay, and through tides. And so there's always a gentle source of heat coming out from inside the Earth. Meanwhile, the sun coming down, right, has always had a gentle amount, 1400 watts per square meter, right, on the Earth. And that flux has been very helpful and has changed very little over time. Like I said in previous lecture, it changes a little bit, right, but it doesn't change a whole lot. And so that steady warmth is always important. Okay, so we'll call that a steady, warm, steady source of warmth. Now, I would say heat, right? Because warm is a sort of subjective human word that explains heat, not too hot, not too cold, but it's warm, right? But if I were talking specifically from science, I would want a steady source of heat that when it reached the surface of whatever planet I'm looking at, in this case, the Earth, right, is like the right amount to keep water liquid. And that's really, really important, right? So do we have that steady source of warmth? That's the second question. So normally we're looking at stars, right, that are kind of like the sun, and we're looking at distances away from that sun that's kind of like Earth. You can have a more luminous star, for example, than the sun. Then you can have a planet farther away and it'll be at the right warmth. Or you can have a very dim star that has much less luminosity than the sun. And then in that case, the nice place for warmth would be kind of right in the middle, a little closer to the star. And we call those, the temperate zones, or sometimes we call them the Goldilocks zones, right? Because Goldilocks and the Three Bears, Goldilocks went to the one that was too hot, didn't like it, too cold, didn't like it, but then got the one that was just right, between hot and cold. And that's like the warm zone. So a steady source of warmth. So we're looking in worlds with liquid water and with steady sources of warmth. In the case of those moons that we were talking about, right, Europa of Jupiter and Enceladus of Saturn, well, those guys, they have warmth from the tides, right, that are coming in from their main planets. Is it enough warmth? Maybe. It seems possible, but it's that stuff that we're still thinking about and working on, right? And maybe that's what we're missing, because with Venus, like, too much heat. Everything is vapor if there's water there. And then Mars, not enough heat. Any H2O there is solid ice. So that's what we're looking for. But here on Earth, we have this nice steady source of warmth for the crusty area on which we live, stuff from the inside and stuff from the outside. So that's what we're looking for, the second thing. What's the third and final thing that we absolutely need to have life on Earth? Well, if you look at all of the stuff that comprises us humans, right? The carbohydrates, the fats, the proteins, the nucleic acids, those kinds of things. You see that even in the simplest of creatures that we would consider alive, there are certain elements that need to come together in this warm, liquidy environment in order to produce the chemical reactions necessary to sustain the kinds of organisms that we call life or living things, right? Remember, even the definition of life is a little bit, ambiguous. We'll talk about that too, coming up, maybe in the next lecture, or maybe later on in this lecture, a little bit about that, and we can talk about how that might work out. Because think about it, right? What do we need? Well, let's see. Carbohydrates, right? Sugars, the things that fuel us, or fats, right? Which are carbohydrates. Well, they've got carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, and other stuff, right? So what are they? There's nitrogen, right? That makes up proteins. You have to have that. Nitrogen, and you have oxygen, and then you have carbon, you have hydrogen. What other elements do we need? Those of you who are versed in the biology or biochemistry stuff know that two other key elements that are necessary are sulfur and phosphorus. Sulfur and phosphorus are very, very important in order for things like nucleic acids, DNA, RNA, things like that to form, and proteins and enzymes and things like that. So the complicated stuff, even the simplest organisms, to make the complex things that happen we call life, we are looking for at least these 6 elements: sulfur, phosphorus, oxygen, nitrogen, carbon, and hydrogen. Okay, now, how can we remember that? By coincidence, it turns out that each of those elements, their chemical symbol is represented by their first letter. Okay, so write it down with me. Sulfur, okay, is S. Okay, phosphorus starts with a P because it's PHOS, right? Phosphorus. Oxygen is an O. So we got sulfur, phosphorus, oxygen, and then we have nitrogen, right? N, and then we have carbon. Carbon starts with a C. How about that? And then hydrogen starts with an H. Hydrogen, of course, most common element in the universe. As well, you already know, the sun is made up of 3/4 of hydrogen by mass, and that's why we have that wonderful nuclear fusion thing leading to both nucleosynthesis and keeping us warm, right? Because all of that heat that's released from nucleosynthesis and nuclear fusion. So sulfur, phosphorus, oxygen, nitrogen, carbon, hydrogen, it spells out a word called sponge. Sponge. How did I come up with that? I didn't. Turns out that my students did. Students just like you. That happened years ago in class. We're trying to write out, like, what are we looking for when we're looking for extraterrestrial life? And we wrote out the letters. I don't think they were in this order at that time. They were just like, carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, H, O, N, whatever. And we looked at it and was like, well, how can we remember this, right? Because writing down 6 letters and trying to randomly remember them isn't all that easy. But if you make them into a word, then it's much more easy to remember. So what are those words to remember? So my students were looking around trying to put these letters together to find something that you can say, right? And people are saying like chomps or ponce or something like that, or sknop, or it didn't quite roll off the tongue really. And then one student, who's, I don't remember who it is anymore, lost to the annals of time, but thank you, whoever did that, said, how about sponge? Like, okay. So sponge, if you can remember this, right? If you want to remember the elements, go for it. Sulfur, phosphorus, oxygen, nitrogen, carbon, hydrogen. And just the easier way to remember it is that these are the first 6 letters, right? For the chemical symbols for these 6 elements that are most important in producing life as we understand it. Sponge. Then a few years ago, one of my students, happened to be on vacation, I think in Spain or in Mexico or something like that. Can't remember where. It was a Spanish-speaking country. And the person sent a picture of something called sponge for me. I thought it was awesome. It was really sweet of him. It turns out it's a candy bar of some kind. Yeah, it's like delicious, yummy food. So if you like sponge, if you really like sponge, right, then you can have that and sit there and remind you of all those wonderful elements that are required for life as we know it here on Earth. But for you, sponge. And I just spent 3 minutes talking about this thing, sponge, but remember why it's there, right? Sulfur, phosphorus, oxygen, nitrogen, carbon, hydrogen, those 6 elements. combined with a steady source of warmth, either from the interior or the exterior of some sort of planetary body, plus the presence of liquid water that can be there and utilized for transport of stuff, of catalyzing chemical reactions, of dissolving things, wonderful stuff. If you can find these three key elements of life on another planet, right, then that is a pretty good indication that there is life on that planet if we give it enough time, right? So I'm going to finish off with that thought process. Think about this. Remember, we talked really in the previous lectures about how different ways of finding planets, right? The Doppler method, the transit method, the direct imaging method, using all these different techniques to find planets, right? And see how many of these thousands of planetary candidates we found are kind of like Earth, right? So far, structurally, we have found maybe a dozen, maybe a couple dozen that seem, based on the best measurements we can make, to be planets that are kind of like Earth, structurally speaking. So now we got to look for those spheres, right? The lithosphere, the hydrosphere, the atmosphere, the biosphere. We're going to look for those cycles, the rock cycle, the water cycle, the carbon cycle. And we're looking for those three ingredients of life as we know it: liquid water, a steady source of warmth, and sponge, right? Or the proper chemical elements necessary to support life as we know it, the building blocks of living organisms. So far, we just haven't had the technology yet to find those things on the surfaces of those planets, those exoplanets that are kind of like Earth, right? Even if we were to find it, even if we were able to build our technology good enough to be able to get those kinds of measurements and see things like, carbon cycles and rock cycles, or the results thereof, of an atmosphere, those kinds of things, we still have to be careful to see if we were taking a look at a time when we are likely to detect life as we know it. If it's a snowball Earth, like thing, like exoplanet, like snowball exoplanet, at that moment, all we would see on the surface is like coldness, right? We might have a few organisms. We're not likely to see a lot. There might be some organisms underneath, and they're almost certainly like organisms underneath that iciness, but we wouldn't be able to see it like cities or jungles or anything like that, right? So everything varies on a time scale. So that's what makes all of this search for extraterrestrial life so interesting. There's lots to see and lots to find. And the great contemporary theory of the solar system, right? Are we alone? Has already been partially answered. No, we are not the only solar system, right? There are many, many other planets outside our solar system in their own solar systems. Again, planetary system. We settled that, in the previous lecture too. We talked about how, but the issue about are we alone in terms of life? Hard to say. All right, how are we going to find that? In the next lecture, I'll talk a little bit about how we might find life, even if we can't find that stuff, right? It has to do with electromagnetic radiation. How about that? Huh? We already learned that a little bit earlier, right? We'll learn more about it now. And we'll talk about how maybe we might be able to find information about extraterrestrial life that's more like us than like bacteria. But again, the timing has got to be a challenge. We don't know whether it's easy or not. And then, of course, we have to think about, well, is there a possibility that that life could have once existed on those planets, but isn't there anymore? Is life fleeting? Is it transitory? Right? Just like how a planet can change from snowball to tropical and everything in between, right, over millions and millions and millions of years. Could the existence of life also be transitory? We've been around for a long time in different forms, but are we always going to be around? What can end life on a total scale, right? Not just on every individual life form that does eventually have a life cycle with a beginning and an end, but like life, if it forms, does it end? How can we end it? What kinds of things cause extinctions from an astronomical perspective? Okay, next lecture, that's where we are. But I hope you had a good one this one. Hope you learned stuff. Make sure to go to the study guides, read up on these things, watch the videos, do the various problems in the study guide that are available. If you have any questions, ask me, ask your recitation instructor, ask your lab instructor. It is all good. Thank you so much. Have a wonderful one. I hope you have a great, great day. Fill out all that stuff. See you in the next lecture. Thanks.